Okay, so our next speaker, for following on with our beef on dairy theme, our next speaker is Professor Ian Lane, who is a leader in ruminant nutrition and profitability with more than 200 published works in the field and over 12,000 citations. As an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney, and managing director of Scibus, Ian has been at the forefront of research and consulting to both dairy and beef producers, and today he's here to share findings from the largest ever study on dairy beef eating quality. So everyone, please welcome Professor Ian Lane with You Don't Eat the Coat. How does beef on dairy stack up?
Well, thank you, and what a wonderful prelude to my talk there was, because that's sort of perfect, because in some respects we're going a little retrospective, looking at the past where we're looking at straight dairy animals rather than crossbreds, and I think Randy Cuthbertson did a lovely job of introducing, a further phase of where we're at. Some of my findings are going to be quite different to some of the statements Randy made, and there's reasons for that. This is a very, very big study. It's rigorously conducted. It involves looking at these questions that really concerned us. The dairy industry's identified wastage of young calves as a major issue, potentially in terms of welfare perception. We also identified that if we avoided, producing a low-value vela, or we could take cattle out to 300 kilos at carcass weight, well, there's about 550 million per annum that could be added to the beef supply chain. So it's a pretty big figure. Beef from dairy is a significant way to go to reduce greenhouse gas, and that's whether you're going straight dairy or whether you're going dairy cross. But all the greenhouse gas is apportioned to the dairy production. It's not apportioned to raising the animal. So in contrast to a beef system where you've got the animal and you've got a maintainer to produce that calf, in the dairy system, all that greenhouse gas for the maintenance is apportioned basically to milk production. So it's one of the profound ways we can change carbon footprint around beef production. I guess with volatile export markets for heifers and sex semen, you've already seen the change in America. We're already doing that here. So we're starting to use more sex semen, starting to be selective, starting to use beef breeds. But what we wanted to look at was a lot of the issues around whether beef out of dairy, straight dairy, is viable. And does it actually meet those statements that Professor Cuthbertson made about being inefficient? So this was a massive project. And I want to acknowledge my co-workers, Rod Polkinghorne, Helen Golder, Holly Cuthbertson, Jane Quinn, Garth Tarr, etc. So it was a big team effort, this one. If we look at the project, there was 1,100 head of cattle in replicated cohorts with breed and treatment differences. And what's really important here is that when we compared the dairy cattle, Holsteins, Holstein Jerseys, Jerseys, we compared them to beef breeds where we took the beef breeds and weaned them early, so put them under a similar system to the dairy cattle. We basically gave them, in the first cohort, they were a little longer with their dams, and that showed up in some of the data. But in the second cohort, we basically got the beef cattle weaned at 12 weeks, and then they were put in the same groups as dairy. So what we had was beef cattle matched with dairy cattle in cohorts grown together. And that is a lot different to what Dr. Cuthbertson was just talking about, where she's talking about the results of things that just come into the yards randomly grown, right? So they've been raised where the beef cattle might go to 9 months, and the dairy cattle are basically weaned, almost at 6 weeks. So a very, very different structure to what was happening just in the field. So we had two groups, two big cohorts, about 580 and 400. And then we also had two groups. We took some Holsteins through, finished on grass. And then we had a high growth group, which was very high starch, two groups in there. And they were basically targeted to finish at 580 kilos at 12 months. We didn't quite get there. We got there at 14. regions right across Victoria mostly. The genetic information on animals was also obtained by genotyping. So the study had these different groups of animals. So what you can see is we had Holsteins, Jerseys, Holstein Jerseys, we had British breeds and we had Euros, and those were the different groups. So when you look at what we actually had in terms of the overall study design, it's pretty complex because we had a lot of finish points. We had them finish both as vealers, so we took them out and we looked at the veal quality. We looked at taking, for example, the Holsteins through on a feedlot system and feedlot harvest. We had them pastured, that group only. We had low-growth Holsteins. They were in the feedlot and also veal. We had HJs, and you can see that that replicated that. And we only had the Jerseys on a high-growth group because we could not see how a low-growth Jerseys would make value. So we decided not to do that group. So it's a very replicated study. And what are the research questions? Research questions, well, we want to know whether dairy breeds would have a lower eating quality score. And what's important about this study is it meets with the Meat Standards Australia, the MLA pathways model, where everything is eaten. And this is the consumers telling you. So it is not some magic formula that we've created. It's actually eaten by consumers, and therefore it's extremely rigorous because they're randomised panels of consumers that we've used. Are the groups' outcomes different when groups are maintained in the feedlot or when the groups are combined differently? So we wanted to keep cattle in their pods, but we also, because of the drought, ended up finishing the first cohort in one big pen. So those animals had different growth pathways, but once they went into the feedlot, they were finished together. Can we document an MSA pathway for veal? Because at the present time, there's no MSA pathway for veal. And we also want to know what's the eating quality of the Holstein steers on grass. And we also looked at a couple of new methods of cooking, because part of the MSA pathway is to look at the optimal presentation of beef for the consumer. Okay, so we might have schnitzels, we might have Texas barbecue, we've got all sorts of different cook methods. You know, obviously strip loin is cooked because that's the most obvious thing to do, but right across we're developing new cook cut methods to try and get the greatest value out of the carcass we possibly can. What are the key findings? Well, the key findings were really interesting. The beef from dairy steers had equivalent eating quality to that of beef breeds when finished in feedlot or supplemented pasture systems. And that, I guess, is contrary to what we've just heard. Okay? But the difference here is that you're rearing the beef cattle in the same cohort. So one of the really important things is that the dairy, when raised the same way very much as the beef, are equivalent in terms of eating quality. I'll show you a little bit of that data then. The other thing that's really important is that the Holsteins in particular perform better than the beef cattle in the feedlot. So the ADGs from the Holsteins in the feedlot were better than the beef cattle. So again, we're tending to refute some of the wisdoms that come from other systems, okay? Because these things were done rigorously with animals grown together, which is the big difference to just taking random numbers into a system and saying, oh, this is the outcomes. So it indicates the quality that we can achieve with these cattle. And part of the validation really was that even on our first cohort that we got slaughtered, one of the processors set up a supply chain straight away to get Holstein beef into their system. So it tells you a lot about just how valid those findings were. So when we compared the productivity of the dairy breeds, what we found was the Holstein steers were heavier at every production stage with HJs and then the Jerseys at the rear end. The growth rates and hot standing carcass weight of the Jersey steers in this study made them less desirable for feedlotting and beef processing, despite comparable and even better eating quality. I mean, one of the really nice things about the Jersey beef was it actually was just numerically, but not significantly, the highest quality beef. So I think there's opportunities for Jersey around branding, but it's going to have to be really carefully done to set up sensible supply chains. I guess at equivalent hot standing carcass weights, the dairy steers typically had similar marbling and ossification, lower P8, which is just fat depth, and rib fat, but they had smaller eye muscle area. Now, this is an interesting one. The eye muscle area reflects the nature of the strip loin in the Holstein, right? But it's a two-edged sword. While it may not necessarily deliver the more rounded and shaped cuts that, I guess the American consumer particularly wants, we're finding that the yield on these carcasses is very good because what they're able to do is get the high dollar yields by getting more, basically, ribeye cut. So what you're finding is that with the longer muscle, but the thinner muscle, it's actually meeting what the consumer wants. So there's some real benefit in that area. Key findings, we did try a novel Spanish diet and compared that to an Australian formulation. Both treatments provided very high quality carcasses, 300 kg, 14 months, although there was a higher rate of liver abscess in the novel group. So the novel group had slightly higher starch content, didn't have agents to control rumen function, but the key point I'd really make in reference to the US data is that our rates of liver abscess are way lower than the US, way lower. So the question is, what is it about that US production system that's placing pressure? Is it perhaps environment, is it damage, in terms of an ascending infection from navel? Is it possibly a failure to adequately control acidosis by diet? There's a lot of different hypotheses that we can run, but certainly our rates of liver abscessation much, much lower than the US. I don't know how we'd tolerate those rates. If I look at and this, incidentally, this supply chain has now been established and it addresses some of the issues that I'll raise later. But if you look at the eating quality, with the 20-minute presentation, I can't provide you with all the data out of this study. But if you look at the eating quality, it's really noticeable. There's the beef breeds over there with a really good performance. The different cuts have different eating quality. So, your cube is a really good option, cube 45. But when you go to the really top cut, you go to the cube 81, and what you can see is that right across the groups, it was a very high quality. You can see that the Holstein is just slightly lower there, but, if you take the top side, the Holstein was higher than the beef. And you can see all the dairy breeds were actually higher than the beef. So very, very comparable eating quality right across the board. Key findings, highest eating quality and MSA compliance was produced through the accelerated growth path. So growing these cattle slightly faster, we targeted 1.2 kilos a day, we got 1.1. We compared them to the slower growth, which were around 0.9. I think we did 0.8s. And so we did find that the high carbohydrate accelerated growth was a much better way to go in terms of that. The higher rates of liver abscess were noted in the dairy breeds compared to the beef breeds, but our rates of liver abscess are way lower. They're down in the single digits. They're not up beyond that. Key findings? Well, the key findings, while dairy veal calves achieved acceptable eating quality, they didn't meet the MSA screening, particularly because of rib fat. The MSA requires a rib fat of 4 mils. Well, you're not going to get 4 mils on a veal, are you? So it's one of the problems there. And that probably led to some cold shortening. And certainly they didn't meet the pH specifications that are in the MSA system. So I think we've got to go back and modify the system to meet the veal calf, because we do need an MSA meeting quality standard for the veal calf. So it's an important area for us to develop. I think the other thing that we need to consider is you know, how do we set up a viable supply chain around that veal model? And, you know, that may require things like alternative chilling methods. So there's a whole lot of consideration that I think needs to go into that veal calf. And the veal calf is about a 150 kg carcass. So, yep, that's where that sits. So what are the findings and the conclusions? The current MSA model worked fine and can be applied to dairy beef carcasses. So you can get MSA feedback on your dairy carcasses when you put dairy carcasses in, and that's very important. We did develop those new schnitzel and Texas barbecue methods, and they're an important adjunct in trying to meet the consumer need. So it's really working with what does the consumer want, how do we best take that carcass apart, how do we best supply the highest quality eating experience around beef for the consumer. So that's the space we're working in. Findings and conclusions, adoption of growth pathways, utilising grass, a combination of grass and feedlot, and very high carbohydrate rations, all produced comparable feed quality. And that's really important. So we can look at a whole lot of production systems and know that if we apply those production systems well, we're going to get high quality carcasses. So that's a really important aspect of it. The results provide us with the potential for social licence to be resolved. And I think, you know, a good thing about Professor Cuthbertson's talk is that we can also see over the next horizon, we're still going to have pure Holstein or pure Jersey or HJs males that we've got to deal with. So these results are important and will be important into the future. But I think the other important thing is to start to look at, you know, what do these crossbreds look like in terms of their performance. And that's good. And part of the social licence is also this greenhouse gas. So we actually have a tremendous benefit for the dairy industry in terms of a marketing position in removing one of these social licence problems around bobby calves. We've also got the potential not just to do that, but to market the greenhouse gas benefits of producing these calves out of dairy cattle. So it's a tremendous benefit. And I guess there's a project underway with Dairy Australia at the moment to develop up options around this whole space and also to do some of the communication. So let's talk a little bit about the problems. One of the problems, and this is one of those things that rarely, there's things that I'm so passionate about, I'm even a little angry about, is the way these cattle are discounted in the market. It is completely irrational. You know, it's the same for a Hereford. If you send a Hereford in, the red and white coat discounts it instantly 50 cents a kilo, right, live weight. Same deal with our dairy breeds. They're discounted badly in the marketplace. That uncertainty leads to uncertainty in investment. So uncertainty investment for the farmer means that the farmer may, rather than actually target putting these out in good order, may say, look, I really don't want to kill them. Are young, I'll grow them out. But instead of growing them out properly, what do? They grow them out slowly. And you end up with just that sort of carcass that Professor Cuthbertson talked about. You're going to end up with a long, lanky animal. And the slaughterhouses don't want them. The heads drag on the ground and the quality of the beef is poor. So what this project was really about was making sure we produced a quality item that could go into the marketplace. Now, that requires some market security. That means that we've got to think about setting up adequate supply chains where at least there's some possibility of a reasonably locked-in margin for everybody involved in it. So it's a really important change. But this discounting and random discounting and volatility in the beef marketplace causes problems that then result in poorer quality beef and certainly result in less animals being raised. So the prejudicial purchase is a problem and it results in problems back into the quality of stock that is supplied. It's a major issue, you know, it's basically $150 a head on a 300 kg carcass weight. So a finished Holstein. So it's a big, big discount. And it also applies, as I said, to other breeds. One of the problems we do see, and this is, I think, something we can sort with the genetics, certainly contribute, is that there was more variance. So while the means were good, right, the variance around the quality of the Holstein or the Holstein Jersey was greater than with the beef breeds. So what you have is that some animals are well designed to be size of dairy beef, but some are not. So that area, I guess, gets resolved if we use more beef breed, but it's going to still be a problem potentially for the ones that we're going to result out of, you know, just the difference in what you get with sex semen. And there's also going to be a reality that you may not want to put all your cattle necessarily to beef because you might be having a bit of a bet each way. So we are going to deal with these animals, but I think one of the things we should be looking for is, I guess, genetic estimates of the value of these cattle for beef production, for dairy cattle for beef production. As we said, the weight of the Holstein Jerseys was probably a little problematic, but it's substantially problematic for the Jerseys. But I think there are opportunities for Jerseys, especially if they think about maybe crossbreeding and doing things a little differently. And lastly, I think the future is bright except for the market manipulation. So we've got to overcome that supply chain issue and work with that to make it better. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Professor Lane. And the photos you put up there looked amazing, and it's great pre-lunch talk, so good timing on that one. We do have a few questions. I know that you put quite a few problems that the industry is facing up on your slide, but if you had to pick one of them, what do you believe would be the greatest impediment to further development of the dairy beef supply chain?
Yeah, I think it's probably the one that's on the slide. And really it's about that discount. You know, the discount just doesn't work. And so, you know, when you've got equivalent quality beef, why is that not being rewarded? And I think that's the problem, is that it's been a source of manipulation. I mean, I've got, you know, a good number of beef clients, and the ones who've got, I guess, red and white cattle, they get discounted 50 cents a kilo, and yet their MSA grades every bit as good as the black cattle. So it is an issue that I think we've got to confront, you know, the purchasers about. You know, it's just untenable to do it when the quality is there. You know, you get an MSA grade, and the MSA grade runs down, you know, these co-grown different breeds. And, you know, one's 50 cents a kilo less than the other. Just doesn't work.
Yeah. So it sounds like the quality is obviously, you've proven that it's equivalent, but I guess what this question online is saying is, well, based on your results, well, then why is there still a reluctance to pay for
Oh, I think that's pretty clear. If you can knock it down $150 a carcass on an arbitrary ground and you're a processor who can do that, then it's a big temptation. You know, I mean, it's another source of profit. So, you know, it's been long-term. It works on a prejudicial basis. I mean, there is a rationale around some of the breeds at the entry to feedlot stage because some don't perform as well in the feedlot due to health issues, right? So at that point, there can be a discount. But there's no point in the discount for a finished animal that comes from the same background, right? So it's around where that price point is executed and is it rational or is it not rational? And I guess the option for the people with different coloured breeds and Holsteins is that they don't have to sell at that point to a feedlot, right? So they can keep them on and take them out to a different state. But if there's no certainty about that other state, at 300 finish, and you're still going to get pinged 50 cents, well, you're probably better off losing the money earlier, right? So that's the big problem. It's really the nub of it.
That makes sense. Thank you for asking those questions.
Oh,
yes, we have a question from the audience. Please stand, say your name, where you're from.
Jeff Hodges from Data Gene. Thanks, Ian. Important work. And I guess this is all about sort of reshaping our carbon future. Just sort of been in the Netherlands last week where they're facing huge pressures. On that, you're talking about the reds and the market discount. I mean, as a kid growing up, it was all about Herefords. I'm just amazed what a fantastic job the black cattle industry's done with their marketing, so there's some hope. But my question is around whether you've got any cider or data on feed conversion efficiency. And as a farmer growing out Frisian steers, we always feel as if they're a very hungry animal, and the further you go towards a pure beef animal, you're on a winner in terms of feed conversion. So is there any data there?
Look, the best thing I can point you to is we weren't able to get FCE data in this particular trial, as you can imagine with the numbers, would have been very, very difficult. And also we wanted to test it in real world feedlots. So we didn't want to have an experimental thing, we wanted to make it real world. What I'd say to you is that theoretically, the Holsteins should outperform, and they did on an ADG basis, the beef breeds. And the reason I say that is that they are not fattening until later, right? So early on, your feed conversion efficiency is driven by protein deposition into muscle. So as you deposit muscle, it's always more efficient than depositing fat. So the big difference is the age at which, or the state at which you're going to get a finish. And that's really the key question. So the Holstein to finish with an even level of fatness will probably be less efficient than your beef animal, but up to a point where you can finish that animal, not necessarily with an equivalent level of fatness, it'll win. And that's exactly what we saw. So, you know, it's really just about nutritional physiology, the way things are deposited. Bottom line is, why is the young animal so efficient? Because it's putting on muscle. Why is it so inefficient later on? Because it's putting on fat.
All right, that's all we have time for questions. We'll make sure that if you submitted a question online, we'll go to the speakers afterwards to have a chance to look at them themselves then. Anyway, thanks very much, Ian.